All right, we are live and sniffling right off the bat. Uh, okay, sorry about that, but joining me today is a very special guest. Brian, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not
Sure.
know you?
So my name is Brian Cutter. I'm currently an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame. I work mainly in philosophy of mind and metaphysics, and recently some philosophy of religion. I got my PhD in 2015 at UT Austin. I worked with Michael Tai and Adam Pouts were my co-advisors. After that, spent a year at NYU and then started here at Notre Dame in 2016. Yeah, within philosophy of mind, which I understand is like the main focus of this channel, I work on the metaphysics of consciousness and philosophy of perception mainly. But I'm kind of interested in all mainly the kind of like big picture fundamental metaphysical questions about the mind and its place in nature, that sort of thing.
That's the good stuff right there. Yeah. So, what year were you at? Were you a Bursaw Fellow at NYU? Is that what you were doing there?
Yeah, that was the year 2015, 2016.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I was wondering if I had run into you since I was hanging around, but I think I was
Yeah,
sparse
I mean
that year.
there was the Mind Group there, and yeah, I mean people from all over the New York area would come and hang out. I don't know if we met when I was there though.
Yeah, I think I had just had my first son, and so it
Oh,
was
okay.
becoming scarce on the scene for a time, so to speak. But okay, very cool. So I actually hadn't realized, not that it matters or anything, but I hadn't formally realized that you came through um, New York. So that's very cool. Now, one of the things that I find very interesting about your work, and you have a lot of sort of videos, and you've done a lot of public philosophy work, I would say, where you write the technical paper, and then you put the paper up, and then you say, "Oh, and here's the podcast discussion of that paper," and you have both of those sort of available on your website, which I personally thought was a very cool format, which I hadn't seen. Have seen other people sort of say, "Here's my talking about it, and here's my paper," but I never saw anyone sort of say just outright, "Here they both are," as though they're both legitimate. And so I found that very nice, actually, that
Hmm.
you engage in this kind of public philosophy. And I just wondered if that was something you intended on doing, or did you just kind of fall into that, or how did you? Do you think of
No,
yourself as
I
a
mean
public philosopher?
I actually have not really made any positive effort to do public philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
though. One thing I found, so right around the time, maybe shortly after getting tenure, I started doing more work in kind of philosophy of religion because that's an interest of mine. And I found like when I would publish things in philosophy of religion, there's this whole like ecosystem of like philosophy of religion
Yeah,
themed YouTube
it's
channels that would
true.
ask me on to do interviews, and in many cases these are people I didn't know, but they had seen my work, and just because, and some of them are professional philosophers, some of them are just kind of people with real jobs who
Yeah,
happen to
exactly.
be interested in philosophy and have YouTube channels, and so yeah, I started getting these invitations mostly about my work in philosophy of religion. But yeah, I think after getting like some visibility in this kind of parallel universe of YouTube philosophy. I started getting more invitations about some of my philosophy of mind work, and so yeah, that's just kind of how it's gone, and yeah.
Good. Well, that's interesting to hear because I've had the same sort of experience. I mean, with my YouTube channel, of finding out that there's this community of people that are very engaged, and especially like in places like Discord and these places that I wouldn't usually typically hang out. But it turns out they've been playing video games this whole time and arguing about philosophy, and then they sort of just jumped into the philosophy. So it's very cool to find these online communities
Yeah.
that see the hunger for philosophy because sometimes people portray philosophy as kind of this out of touch discipline that is an ivory tower, but actually people are very interested in these questions
Yeah.
and very interested in the arguments. And it's very nice to see people with expertise coming and saying, "Look, okay, let's be serious about this, and but do it in a public way." So I very much enjoy that,
Yeah.
and I hope that people continue in this vein. And actually, on that topic, I wanted to kind of bring up the one of the other kind of things that I like about your work a lot is that you do connect these kind of abstract questions in the philosophy of mind to questions in the philosophy of religion, which sometimes you find in passing, maybe in a philosopher's work here or there, but you've been doing it in a very explicit way, and I'm thinking of certain recent papers of yours about psychophysical harmony, but also just in other places where you really take seriously like what do these things about the mind, these philosophical views, contribute to these other discussions. So, and you were saying that that was just you did that after you got tenure, or were you always thinking along these lines of connecting these two areas, or
Well, I mean, ever since at least graduate school, I've been very interested in philosophy of religion and kind of big picture metaphysical questions and, naturalism versus theism and things like this.
right?
And I've always seen these as interestingly connected to philosophy of mind. And I mean, I think a lot of people do, and there's a kind of natural attitude that a lot of people have, where there's if you want to go in for some kind of dualism about consciousness, that's going to cohere a little more nicely with certain non-naturalistic views. I mean, that there's an interesting question here. Of course, there are people like David Chalmers who argue for like naturalistic forms of dualism and
Right.
say, no, you can say that consciousness is irreducible to any physical processes, but still kind of linked to the physical by laws of nature. And we don't need to embed that within like any kind of like bigger picture where there's like a supernatural creator or anything like that. And
Right.
certainly those views are logically consistent. I'm kind of increasingly of the opinion that the combination of dualist-like views about consciousness and metaphysical naturalism, while there's no incompatibility there, they're not actually going to play very well together.
Hmm.
And that's one of the themes of my work on psychophysical harmony. But yeah, I one of the reasons I'm interested in the metaphysics of mind is just because I think questions in the metaphysics of mind have bearing on these broader kind of worldview questions about like naturalism versus, various alternatives.
Yeah, interesting. So now I wonder if I could just like pause here for a second and ask you a follow up on this, because one thing, so for someone like me, who I don't think of myself as a physicalist. I think of myself as someone who's friendly to physicalism and someone who thinks of physicalism as not having been refuted by a priori arguments. So I think we're going to have a discussion about that because you, I think, disagree. So let's table that for now, though, if you don't mind, and just kind of take physicalism like serious for a second. Because the question that I want to ask you is about this link between your view about the mind and the view about theism. And I'm wondering if it really is your view that you couldn't be a Christian physicalist, or a Muslim physicalist, or just generally a theist physicalist. Now, I heard you say that, yeah, more naturally dualism sort of fits with it and blah, blah, blah. But I'm wondering, actually, I didn't mean to say blah, 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 but I meant et
Yeah.
cetera, obviously, the professional term. But what I meant to say was, do you think there's some kind of formal contradiction here, or do you think that you could parody your psychophysical harmony argument from the physicalist point of view by saying, well, roughly speaking, consciousness is physical, it can't be explained naturalistically, so God must have done it, or there must. So is that kind of how is that argument not a similar type of argument, and how do you feel about that kind of parody move? I guess is what I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, first of all, I think, yeah, physicalism about consciousness is compatible with theism.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, maybe physicalism about the entirety of reality isn't compatible with theism, at least if theism is defined as like an immaterial being with certain properties. But physicalism about human beings and, their mental states could well be true, even if the whole physical world, including human beings, was created by an immaterial God. There's no incompatibility there. When it comes to,
But with consciousness being physical.
yeah, with consciousness being
Okay.
physical. So, I mean,
So
there are in fact Christian theist philosophers who are physicalist about consciousness. So, Peter Van Inwagen is one example.
right.
So he thinks that human beings are wholly material things. We don't have any immaterial parts like souls or anything like that. And moreover, we don't have any property, like our mental properties wholly supervene on, the arrangement of physical parts and the ways in which they interact and so forth. And so he's not even like a property dualist about
Right.
consciousness. Now, I do think that when it comes to certain specific forms of theism, like Christian theism, there's at least going to be difficulties that arise in trying to combine that with physicalism about the mind or about consciousness or about human persons. I mean, so two big issues come to mind. One is, there are arguments out there that I find pretty plausible that physicalism is incompatible with like a really robust kind of free will. Just because, if I'm just like a complicated collection of material parts and those parts are just kind of following the scripts provided by the laws of physics, then in some like deep and ultimate sense, I don't have control over what I do, or maybe I do in some kind of watered down compatibilist sense, but maybe not in the sense that would ground like really deep ultimate responsibility. And then secondly, you can argue that, at least some theistic religious traditions like Christianity and other theistic religions, they do require a kind of like deep metaphysically robust free will and moral responsibility. And then the other connection would just be like making sense of the possibility of an afterlife. So, Peter Van der Wagen, who's like a physicalist about human persons, will say, okay, the afterlife, it doesn't involve the continued existence of a disembodied soul after death. But he thinks that, that was never the Christian conception of the afterlife anyway. The Christian conception involved like a bodily resurrection.
Yeah.
But okay, fine. But there's still a question of like, well, how could God resurrect me? I see how God could resurrect like a look-alike.
Yeah.
He could take a bunch of atoms and form them in a Brian-like shape. But would that really be me? Now you got to worry about like personal identity conditions. Maybe there's not the right kind of like causal continuity between, me at death and this like reassembled version,
Right.
person who looks kind of like me. And, Peter Van der Wagen has
Things
weird
to
things to
say.
say about
Yeah,
how to
I
solve
know.
this problem, but it's certainly a difficulty. Whereas, if you're some kind of like substance dualist and there's like an immaterial soul that's an essential part of you that continues to exist after bodily death, there's maybe a more straightforward story for how you could continue to exist.
I mean, there's a big maybe there, but what you could at least check. But
Yeah.
I wonder. I mean, just for the record, this was kind of Locke's problem. That reason why Locke got all interested in John Locke got interested in personal identity was because of issues about the resurrection. If I understand the history of this stuff correctly, so yeah, because this is why I was asking. I was curious about whether your view was that it ruled out of you like Inwagens actually, or Van Inwagens, or because I was hearing you say that dualism was like more. I guess you mean just more like commonsensically the thing that's often associated with these kinds of views.
Well,
But I
at
thought you were
least
saying something stronger.
at least that. I guess I do think that given the truth of at least property dualism, there is considerable philosophical pressure to reject metaphysical naturalism. That's neutral as to whether the other direction holds, whether given materialism about consciousness, whether there's philosophical pressure to accept naturalism. Uh, I guess what I would be inclined to say there is given, well, given physicalism about consciousness, there wouldn't, it's not clear that there are like consciousness specific reasons to reject naturalism. I'm not totally sure about this. I mean, this is going to interact a little bit with, questions about cosmological fine-tuning. So, given physicalism about consciousness, presumably you need certain very specific physical configurations to come about in order to get conscious beings. And then, you could argue that like the basic physical laws and constants needed to be highly fine-tuned in order to get the relevant configurations.
Right.
And therefore, maybe the best explanation for why there are physical beings that can be configured in the right way so as to realize consciousness. Maybe like theism figures as the best explanation for that. But that's going to connect more with just kind of general arguments from cosmological fine-tuning and the fact that like our universe is structured in such a way that, you know, there can be like complicated embodied life and so forth.
Right. So, okay, well, there's a lot that I want to follow up on there, but I'm trying, okay, let me try to make a mental note of those things and say, so if you grant that this is like, at least epistemically, in the realm of things to consider, then what do you make of the parity argument from there to the existence of God from the kind of, you know, miraculous physical nature of, because if I understand the psychophysical harmony, it's kind of, you know, first you have to assume, you know, that the epistemic arguments against physicalism are good, which I want to question, but we'll get to that later. But if you take that first step, then of course there is a natural question about why they line up in the way they do. If it really is, you know, metaphysically possible that they could be any which way, and in fact, you know, Chalmers says so in many places that there are worlds where they're slightly different, very different, partially overlapped, anything that's not logically contradictory. So it is kind of a miracle that we're in the one that where they line up. So that I sort of think that if you take that view of the nature of consciousness, you end up with this question, and you rightly press that point. However, what I was wondering about is what you might think about a kind of physicalist version of that argument, where there was like a physicalist theist who was saying, rather than assuming that notion of consciousness, you could assume the physicalist notion of consciousness, and then argue that this suggests that God must exist in order to account for why something impossible like that could be the case. Seemingly impossible for people like me, really impossible for people like you. So, and I was wondering if you think that's a good argument for the existence of God, that someone who was a like theist identity theorist or something might give, and if not, why not?
So, so on this version of the argument, what is it that God is supposed to be explaining? Is God explaining why consciousness is identical with, you know, this physical property?
Yeah. And it's
So,
like a miraculous thing in the way in which the Trinity is, or something like that. The three, you
oh,
know, it's kind of can't be explained naturalistically. It has to be something that only could be supernaturally explained, because it seems contradictory to many people or logically impossible or something like that. But there it is. So might say this Christian or theistic identity theorist, as I'm imagining them.
so I guess I would have thought that God couldn't possibly explain the property, the truths about property identities, because these are just kind of necessary truths that like wouldn't be subject to the divine will. I mean, the traditional view, um,
You mean so? Wait, are you saying that God couldn't change brute identities?
yeah, I
Okay.
think God could not change Buddha. I mean, the traditional view within the at least the Christian, the history of Christian thought on this matter is God has control over what contingent realities are like, but not over necessary truths. So the mainstream view within the Christian theological tradition is God couldn't have made 2 + 2 = 5,
Mm-hmm.
but God could have made, say, unicorns, or, you know, seven-headed monsters, or he could have made there not be any horses. So what he has control over contingent matters, but not over necessary matters. And you know, he couldn't have made the property of being a bachelor other than you know, something distinct from the property of being an unmarried male. So when it comes to necessary truths, I don't really see how those would be subject to divine control, and therefore I don't see how their truth could be something that could be explained by God. Um,
You don't think there's logically impossible worlds?
well, I'm happy to say that there are logically impossible worlds. I mean, we can, if we identify worlds with just certain sets of propositions, you can take sets of propositions that aren't compossible, and those can be identified with logically impossible worlds. I just think God can't realize any logical possible worlds because if he could, then they would be possible.
They
Like
are. I mean,
if
that's a
someone
trick of
if
words, though.
someone
Isn't
can bring
that?
something,
Come on. If I mean, they're logically
well,
impossible worlds. That's like saying, I mean, they are possible worlds in one sense of that term. They're the possible worlds in which the laws of logic are different or altered, or in which nothing is necessary, depending on your definition of these things. But they're possible worlds under the I mean, so saying they're not they would be possible worlds if they were possible. It seems like a
well, so it seems plausible to me that if someone has the ability to bring it about that P, then P is possible. So conversely, if P is impossible, then no one has the ability to bring it about that P. So if I have the ability to bring it about that there are 6 cups on my table, it follows that it's metaphysically possible for there to be 6 cups on my table. But conversely, if it's metaphysically impossible for there to be a round square, then it follows that I don't have the ability to bring about a round square.
right.
And the same goes for God.
You
God doesn't have the ability
well,
to bring about a round square. So this wasn't, so
yeah,
Descartes held an opposing view. Descartes
right.
thought that God had the ability to bring about logically impossible situations. That's not the dominant view, and that's not really the view that I'd be attracted to. But I mean, there are a range of options here for theistic philosophers.
I mean, that sounds convenient though to me, but I guess this isn't my main point, so I don't want to pursue this unless I do kind of want to because it's interesting to me. And I'm going to be talking to Graham Priest next week, which is why I'm thinking about logically impossible worlds. But because I happen to think we live in one, and
Okay.
I am convinced that there may be true contradictions, and I do like alternative logics. But that's a different.
Okay, so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of just working with like my kind of classical logical assumptions.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, if you take seriously that there are contradictions or could be, then yeah, I mean, if there are true contradictions, then maybe God can be responsible for them. And maybe one of those contradictions is like the identity of consciousness with some physical property.
Yes.
I I still, even if we kind of take on board that background sensibility, I don't immediately see how to turn that into an argument for theism. Maybe it could. I mean, the key question would be what, I mean, I kind of think of this in broadly Bayesian terms. Like we have some datum, and is the datum more likely conditional on theism than conditional on atheism? And if it is, it's going to be some evidential support for theism. And how much evidential support will just depend on the Bayes factor, how much more likely it was conditional on theism than on atheism. Now, take one of these kind of paradoxical psychophysical identities. Is there any reason to think that that's more likely conditional on theism than on atheism? Maybe you could make that case. Maybe you could argue that just from the value of consciousness and the fact that a perfectly good being would be motivated to realize good states of affairs, like
Yeah.
involving consciousness. And so maybe you could make that case. But yeah, I guess you would probably need to have this kind of Cartesian idea that God can bring about contradictions, which I'm not so on board with, but I could see there are theists like J.C. Beale who
Right,
are
exactly.
on board with the idea that like God can do these contradictory things,
And much more. He could like
in
have
his
no
picture,
truth
like
values for
there's
things.
there's contradictions like in the very like in God himself, like the doctrine of the Trinity is both
Exactly.
contradictory and true, and same with the doctrine of the incarnation. And I think he might want to say the same thing about evil. Like the existence of a perfectly good God is incompatible, like it is inconsistent with evil, as
Yeah.
Mackie said, but nonetheless, there's both God and evil.
Exactly.
So anyway,
So I mean, I think a lot of these kind of point to that God's has to be dialethic in some sense. But I mean, you can even kind of, I toyed around when I was in grad school with the idea that you could generate a sentence that, this God doesn't know that this sentence is true or something like that,
Oh, right.
and it kind of proved that he has to be this either knowing and not knowing at the same time. Anyway, so I do think there are interesting questions here. However, that wasn't really what I was intending to get us into. I just happened to proximity to Graham's work made me veer off there. But the reason why I originally brought that up, if you don't mind my trying to steer it back to there, was because I was thinking that you were going to say something like that. And then I was hoping that you would see that someone who was friendly to the identity theory would think that that's the way your psychophysical harmony argument sounds to them. That you are trying to pry apart something which can't be pried apart and then use God as an explanation for how they get stuck together. And the first premise there, that they can be pried apart, is already like, assuming something about the nature of these things that's impossible, which is kind of the response that you were giving me about my theistic identity theorist. And it's kind of, so I just wanted to see if you feel like that kind of parody of like, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. Do you agree that that's there or not? I guess that's ultimately what I was pushing towards.
So I definitely agree that it's someone who starts out accepting the identity theory. It's natural for them to not be on board initially with the psychophysical harmony argument.
Right.
And so I mean I totally grant that the psychophysical harmony argument is most effective from a starting point that grants, taking seriously the hard problem of consciousness and associated kind of like dualist flavored views.
But you can take serious the hard problem without being
Yeah.
a dualist, like I
Yeah,
do.
sure. Yeah.
I'm not
So
not taking it seriously. I am.
yeah, so maybe I should rephrase that. Like, if we start out with dualist assumptions,
Yeah.
then I think the psychophysical harmony argument is that it sails much more smoothly.
Right.
Now, in the paper, what Dustin Crummett and I do is kind of go through some non-dualist views of consciousness and try to argue that actually the reasoning doesn't totally break down if we take seriously these alternatives, though the issues get a little bit trickier. So, one possibility is, well, maybe we don't like dualism, but we like Russellian monism. So, but so here the thought is like, well, physics tells us the kind of abstract structure of reality, the kind of causal and spatiotemporal and mereological structure of reality, but it doesn't tell us what material things are like intrinsically in their kind of intrinsic qualitative categorical respects. So those aspects are called like the quiddities, and maybe like you could have different quiddities realizing the same abstract structure described by physics. That's at least one way of developing the Russellian monist view.
Right.
And as Adam Pautz has argued and others, like this still is going to give rise to a kind of psychophysical luck where you could have swapped out the actual quiddities for different quiddities, and then you would have got different forms of consciousness that maybe wouldn't have been harmoniously aligned with the physical stuff in the way that it is in the actual world. And so
Agreed. Yeah.
there's still a kind of luck going on. It's not quite luck in like what the fundamental psychophysical laws look like. It's luck in which quiddities realize the relevant structural profiles. And so the argument takes a slightly different form, but
Yeah, but notice that the Russellian panpsychist or monist or whatever still agrees that you start with dualist assumptions. You just end up with some other weird view. But the argument doesn't track against like an identity theorist who says that pain is a brain state, because then it's no mystery why pain produces the adverse behavior it does, because that physical state is what produces that behavior, and it is pain. So of course it does that. It lines up perfectly as it should. And you don't get these weird questions about how they line up in this way.
Well, yeah, so I think there are a few complications. I mean, first of all, I do want to concede that for someone who starts out totally convinced in the identity theory, that against that person, the argument will be least effective.
But what if that person is only like convinced that the identity theory should be taken seriously? So you don't have to be totally convinced of it, but just that it's a contender that shouldn't be dismissed.
Yeah, so I think if someone just has that attitude, then I think the argument can go through.
But with less force.
Well, maybe to some extent less force. So a couple things. One, suppose you think you're an identity theorist, but you identify phenomenal properties, not with role functional properties, but with the like biological realizers of the relevant role functional properties. So, you say like pain is C fiber firing rather than pain is having some state or other that plays the pain role. Okay.
Right.
Well, in that view, there still might be a kind of lucky correspondence between the actual realizers of the pain role and the role that it plays. Because, in this view, you could have had a different experience play the pain role, and that different experience might not have like normatively harmonized with that role to the same extent that the actual one does. So if you're a kind of like identity theorist who identifies phenomenal properties with realizer level properties, I think there's a way of pushing a similar argument. But even setting that aside, suppose you come to it just with the attitude that, like, look, I'm not sure what the right view in the metaphysics of mind is. I'm open to identity theory. I'm open to dualism. I'm
Yeah.
open to whatever else.
I think that is the right attitude, by the way.
Yeah, so I mean, that's certainly a reasonable attitude. I still think the argument is still going to go through if we just think of it in Bayesian terms. And so, the datum is there's this nice harmonious correspondence between the experiences, like our experiences, and the associated functional roles they play.
Right.
Now, basically, the way the Bayesian argument is going to go is this datum, this harmonious correspondence between the physical and the phenomenal facts, is better predicted, is more likely conditional on theism than it is conditional on atheism. So the first part of that is, it's not too unlikely conditional on theism because of the value associated with psychophysical harmony. The second part is it is very, very unlikely conditional on atheism. Now, here's why I think taking seriously the identity theory doesn't really affect that low likelihood for the probability of harmony conditional on atheism.
Okay.
So the claim that phenomenal properties are identical with physical properties is neutral as to which phenomenal properties are identical to which physical properties.
Right.
And given the epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal, even if there are true identities, they're not going to be a priori. So that it's not going to be like a priori certain that pain is C fiber firing rather than something else.
I mean, some
A
people say
priori-
that, but it needs to be argued for. I mean, I don't agree.
Well, let's grant the epistemic gap.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So given the epistemic gap, it's going to be a priori. If we think that there's a possibility of psychophysical identities, then it should be a priori possible that pain is C fiber firing, that pain is D fiber firing, that pain is in any number of physical properties. Most of these identities would not result in the kind of harmony that we're talking about. Only a small number would, and so you can argue that it's unlikely that you would get harmonious psychophysical identities.
I mean, you're kind of assuming the thing you said you shouldn't assume, which is that the thing is not essentially that way. I mean, if pain is a physical state, then that's what it is. It can't be realized in some other way. That's pain. That's like, so if water is H2O, then water is H2O. It couldn't have been some other way. It's necessarily the case that water is H2O. There may be some other imaginable situations in a 2D semantic framework where you could say some other world has XYZ, that's great, but it's necessarily not our world.
Right, but when we're thinking...
So it depends, a lot of this depends on your background views about modality and so forth and so on. So I just don't think, and also your views about the prior probability of God's existence. So if you're someone who thinks that there's like almost a negligible prior probability. So for example, for me, I sort of think it's almost contradictory, the concept of the theistic God. So unless you accept dialetheism, it's just kind of like your prior probability should be like almost zero. But you don't agree with that. And lots of other people I know don't. So when I Bayesian out the math, the identity theory goes up. The theistic goes down. When you Bayesian out the math, it goes the other way, which seems to me suggests there's a problem with that way of reasoning for this kind of argument.
So a few things. On the first point, I think it's important to distinguish metaphysical modality versus epistemic modality. So it's true that, given the identity theory, pain couldn't have been anything other than C fiber firing or
Right.
whatever. But when we're doing the Bayesian arguments, we're looking at epistemic probabilities distributed over epistemic possibilities. And, it's a familiar fact that epistemic possibilities can come apart from metaphysical possibilities. So if we don't yet know whether Hesperus is phosphorus, there's an epistemic possibility in which it is, and there's a epistemic possibility in which it's not.
Right.
And we can go about like gathering evidence for the claim. So we can say things like, well, if Hesperus is phosphorus, then we would expect that when we measure their sizes, we'll get similar measurements. Whereas if it's not, we would expect they wouldn't. And so like all this reasoning, so we can do like Bayesian arguments like what should we expect if Hesperus is identical to phosphorus versus not.
Right.
And so I mean that just makes sense.
I agree.
And so like all the kind of Bayesian apparatus and epistemic probabilities, these are distributed across epistemic possibilities, even though we agree at the end of the day,
Is it an epistemic possibility that water is not H2O?
A priori it's an epistemic possibility. I mean,
Not if you know some stuff it isn't.
Well,
What
so
do you-
I mean,
what do you mean?
It depends on
It's
what's in the
only a
background.
priori if you don't know some chemistry or some physics. Otherwise, it is a priori knowable that water is H2O. At least I think so. I think it's scrutable or whatever from the base facts that water is H2O. If you front load the conditional statement, if the world is in such and such a way, I mean, I sort of like by that Chalmers argument. So I just
So
don't.
that might be it might be a priori that if the world is such and such way in relation to me, then water is H2O.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's not a priori that water is H2O. So there's
Once you add that, oh, the world is this way and chemistry is like that, then it is. You can know a priori that water is H2O.
So I just think there's two claims here. There's just the claim water is H2O.
Right.
And then there's a conditional claim. If the world is such and such way, then water is H2O. My claim is the first is not a priori, but the second is. But here's another.
Both of them are, is what I'm saying.
But here's another claim that's a priori. If the stuff in lakes and streams around here, et cetera, is made of XYZ, then
Right.
water is XYZ. I claim that's a priori too. Like
Right.
the identity of water in H2O and the identity of water in XYZ like are on a par with respect to their a priori.
Except we can a priori know that
Neither
one
is a
false
priori
now.
simplicator, but both like figure in a priori conditionals.
Right, but my point is that one of them, we can now know a priori which one is false. Like an ideal reasoner who just knew all the facts would know which one was actual and which one wasn't. So it is a priori knowable that water is H2O. It just isn't how we came to know it. We came to know it empirically because we had to learn empirically that the antecedent of that conditional was confirmed. But you can just front load that information into a new conditional, and that can be known a priori. So
even
an
the
ideal reasoner would know a priori that water is H2O. If it
Even
is.
an ideal reasoner wouldn't know that a priori. They'd know the conditional a priori that if things are thus and so, then water is H2O.
Right.
But that's different from knowing a priori that water is H2O. Like
How is
so
it
I-
different?
Well, so like here's an example. I know a priori that if you're wearing a navy blue shirt, then you're wearing a blue shirt. But I don't know. And an ideal knower could know that too. I don't know a priori that you're wearing a blue shirt. That you're wearing a blue shirt is not the kind of thing that could be known a priori.
But you could know this a priori, which is that if I'm wearing a navy blue shirt, then I'm wearing a blue. If I'm wearing a navy blue shirt and I'm wearing a blue shirt, then I'm wearing a navy blue shirt or whatever. So you just front load the fact that this is the case into a new conditional, and that conditional can be known a priori.
Yeah, that's a conditional claim, and that can be known a priori.
Exactly, and it
I'm
builds
just claiming
in
that the unconditional.
the world is that way because this is under ideal conditions. So an ideal reasoner would know that. An ideal reasoner who knew all the facts would know a priori that water was H2O because they would know which conditional, because they would know all the facts.
But I
So
mean, some of those facts would have to be known a posteriori. Are you assuming they know all the facts a priori?
what I'm assuming is that you can make a difference between the justification, which could be a priori, and the way they acquired the facts, which may not be a priori, but may be empirical, but nonetheless doesn't figure in the a priori reasoning. The way you acquired the concepts that you're using, or the way you acquired the stuff that goes into the conditional, isn't what figures in the process by which you reason to the conclusion, and therefore isn't part of the justification, and it doesn't count as empirically based, therefore, even if it was in fact discovered empirically.
Yeah, I don't know if I have more on this. I mean, I just think
So you don't think that it can be
there's the
known?
conditional that's a priori, there's the consequent that's not. I agree that there's a kind of a priori mode of reasoning from the antecedent of the conditional to the consequent. But I think if the antecedent of the conditional includes some a posteriori information, that doesn't then the resulting knowledge by doing a priori reasoning from that wouldn't count as a priori. But
I mean, I think that's a
I'm not sure
substantive. I'm
how.
not sure why you think that, since there's the way the knowledge was acquired isn't part of the definition of what counts as a priori. Not, it counts as what justifies it. So what's the justification for it? And in this case, there's no empirical justification. There's empirical justification when you acquire the information. Then you build it into the conditional statement and you reason, and there's no empirical justification there.
I mean, it wouldn't it follow from that everything can be known a priori?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the yes, that's the view.
So okay. I mean, so in this sense, everything can be known a priori, but some things can be evidence for. I mean, I wouldn't want this to be a recipe for just undermining any Bayesian argument for anything. I mean, so
I mean, it
the
kind of
structure
is
of the
though.
argument
That's
is a
the
Bayesian argument. Like here's a datum. It's more conditional on hypothesis one than hypothesis two, so it raises the probability of hypothesis one relative to hypothesis two. And it sounds like you're saying, well, the datum, if you think about it in a certain way, the datum is a priori, and it's like certain a priori, so it can't be evidence for anything because it can't be more likely conditional on anything than anything else. But I mean, to the extent that you could just make the same moves about literally any empirical datum that's used for literally any Bayesian argument for any hypothesis, then I feel like there's some kind of overgeneration going on here.
I
I mean,
might be losing. So maybe we'll have to circle back around to this.
yeah.
But so because what I originally was trying to get at here was what counts as an epistemic possibility, which you were using. And I was suggesting that if you had an ideal reasoner, there wouldn't really be any such thing as epistemic possibility anymore. If you knew all the facts and you were an ideal reasoner, that epistemic possibility would be shut because you would be able to a priori deduce from everything you have the way things are. And then you would know. And so it sounds like that's what I was trying to get at the idea that these things could be a priori known, at least at the limit of ideal reasoning, and so that the question of epistemic possibility isn't sort of what I'm invoking. I'm invoking metaphysical possibility in the way I was talking before, because I'm kind of imagining an ideal reasoner who knew everything. And there would be no open possibilities anymore. They'd all be like, everything's knowable from that point of view. And maybe you would say, well, not everything. What about consciousness and so forth? And everyone has their favorite exception to the everything can be known. I personally would say no, consciousness as well. But that's, I agree, controversial. But I don't think that this other thing I'm saying should be as super controversial, that an ideal reasoner wouldn't have any epistemic possibilities open, except for things that they couldn't know about, like maybe consciousness. But even there, I'd go, I don't know. So yeah.
Well, I would want to distinguish being ideal qua reasoner versus being like a totally ideal epistemic agent, where an ideal reasoner is someone who can deduce all the a priori consequences of whatever they happen to know, but it's neutral as to what they happen to know. So maybe you could have an ideal reasoner who doesn't know any or very much contingent information, but whatever they have, they can deduce all the consequences of that. Whereas like an ideal epistemic agent is kind of like they're omniscient with respect to the facts and ideal at kind of drawing out consequences. So I guess if we just focus on the ideal reasoner and we don't assume that they have complete factual information about the world, then I would think an ideal reasoner would have lots of epistemic possibilities open to them. Like they wouldn't know, you could have someone who's an ideal reasoner who doesn't know how tall the tallest giraffe is. Maybe if you told them all the information about where all the particles are, et cetera, they could figure that out. But maybe they don't have that
And
information.
then they would know
They're still an ideal reasoner in the sense that given any information, they can deduce all the relevant consequences, but it's no knock against your reasoning ability that you happen not to have some factual information about the world.
Yeah, I think we are maybe slightly not talking past each other, because I agree with what you're saying right now. But what I was trying to say was that suppose you had that ideal reasoner, and then the ideal scientist, and they were separate, and the ideal scientist went out and discovered all the facts, and then they just gave those facts to the ideal reasoner, just delivered it one day, and the ideal reasoner just started reasoning based on those facts. Then they would know certain things, like that water is H2O and that the tallest giraffe is that one, etc. And there would be no further open questions.
Yeah, I agree
That's
with
what
that.
I was saying. And so when we say that water is H2O, we're taking that point of view, that we're not guessing about it. We're saying it is, that's the way it is, and that you could know that from the ideal, that if the ideal reasoner with those facts could deduce that. So I wasn't saying just from reason itself you could know that water is H2O, but it is a priori for that reasoner. That reasoner a priori knows that water is H2O because they don't have any empirical justification. The ideal scientist did all the empirical stuff. The ideal reasoner is just going, oh, so this is the way things are. And I don't see that as like a knock against saying that what they did was a priori. That's the point I was trying to make.
Okay. I want to come back to this issue. So you raised the other interesting issue of like, of course, these Bayesian arguments are going to depend on the priors.
Yeah.
I mean, so you made a couple points here. One is that, well, because of the sensitivity to the priors, maybe the Bayesian approach to arguing about these things just isn't the way to go. And then you claim that, maybe theism has a negligible prior. So
For me, I said, no. I said,
yeah, for you,
yeah,
or
yeah. But for you, I don't think that. I think for you, it's high, and that's the problem.
which is related. Maybe there's just so much interpersonal variation in what we regard as the reasonable priors that this is not the right approach. I mean,
That was
of
the
course
point I
there
was
is
making. Yeah.
this deep issue in like, Bayesian forms of reasoning, that there is this sensitivity to the priors, and there's frustratingly little that one can say to justify, this prior rather than that prior. I mean, you can hand wave some stuff about simplicity or whatever.
Well, but I
But
think you would
I
hand
kind
wave
of
some
just think
stuff
that's
about like considering all the arguments and looking at the evidence and talking to the experts and all things considered, and we still end up with different values.
yeah. I guess I just think this is an inescapable fact of life. I mean, because yeah, I mean, I think any good reasoning could in principle be reconstructed in Bayesian terms. Uh, and at the end of the day, there is going to be some sensitivity to priors and maybe a difficulty in justifying which priors are the rational ones. But it's not like anyone knows a better method that does result in like everyone converging on the same answers at the end of the day. Like,
Well,
some
the
people
empirical
argue
method,
about what?
the empirical method certainly has a better
Well,
track record.
but I guess I would say that in that like scientific reasoning is, well, sometimes it's explicitly Bayesian, and when it's not explicitly Bayesian, to the extent that it's good, it can at least be like rationally reconstructed in Bayesian terms. Um,
I mean, there's a debate, between Bayesians and frequentists about statistics and
yeah,
all of this. I mean, there's a
I mean,
huge set of issues here. So I think that's kind of like sweeping a bunch of stuff under the rug. But I understand that Bayesianism is very popular. I'm just suggesting that when you're trying to establish an argument for God's existence, and you're working in a domain that's not well behaved, let's say, then it just seems suspicious that you would put so much weight on an argument structure like this, which only should be trusted in a well behaved domain.
um, so I do think the basic, well, versions of the psychophysical harmony argument could be formulated in like a non-Bayesian terms, just in terms of inference to the best explanation. And, you know,
But you get the
these,
same problem though, because my best explanation is going to end up being the identity theory because of my background assumptions, and your best explanation is going to end up being theism. And I don't really see how that, you can do less math that way, I guess, and then it's more feely, but you're still just basically doing the same thing.
oh, right. Yeah. I mean, I guess I agree at the end of the day, there's not going to be a deeply important difference but between them.
Yeah.
The
Well, I mean, because look,
the
remember the
but
reason.
I mean, so but
Yeah, sorry,
you
go ahead.
agree that in principle there, so w w maybe here's a question for you. Maybe you're not convinced by psychophysical harmony as being like a convincing argument for God or any kind of designer or whatever. But is there any conceivable empirical fact that if we discovered it, you would regard as evidence for something like God or a designer? Like if the stars arranged to like spell out the prologue to the Gospel of John or whatever. I mean, if that happened, I would say, this is some empirical evidence for God. And if I wanted to be kind of mathematically rigorous about it, maybe I would formulate it in Bayesian terms that, this exact message in the stars is significantly more probable conditional on theism than conditional on atheism or whatever. And, you could make the same points about like, this is going to depend on the priors and blah, blah, blah. But like, yeah, in that case, do you think that that would be like evidence for or something that would be
It'd be evidence for
best
something, but
explained
but
by?
but so I'm
Mhm.
very worried about like this kind of problem in a different. By the way, I realize we're talking a lot about this philosophy of religion stuff. So if we ever want to talk about consciousness, maybe we'll get to that. But I'm enjoying this discussion, so I hope
Yeah,
it's okay with you. But Brian, tell me if you want to like go off this topic
I'm happy to
at any
talk
time.
whatever.
And I'm also respectful of your time. So if you have to leave at any time, let me know. But I can hang up for another half hour or so if that's all right with
Cool.
you. Okay. Anyway, so this is I don't know, I think it was Camus maybe or Sartre
Hmm.
who talked about the anguish of Abraham. Do you know this traditional kind of thing in existentialism?
I know Kierkegaard's discussion of Abraham and fear and
Maybe it is
trembling. I don't know.
Kierkegaard.
Okay, yeah, he's got
It's one of
some.
these existentialists. I'm not an existentialist scholar, so
Yeah.
I just remember some existentialists bringing this up and maybe calling it the anguish, the problem, the anguish of Abraham.
Yeah.
And the basic idea of the problem, as I read it, is an epistemic problem, which is that suppose you think that God commands you to do X, and then you infer that it's God who commanded you to do X. And
Hmm.
the question is, why? How do you know it wasn't something else that commanded you to do this? Like,
Yeah.
especially maybe a demon, or if you were already in this realm, maybe some demonic force is commanding you.
Yeah.
Especially combined with the idea that it's telling you to do something which strikes many people as like immoral, like kill your own son, and strangely, it should be like the last thing you would ever think of doing. And so all of these things together should kind of make you immediately question that the thing that you're getting is
Yeah.
from an ultimately good source, and you would be skeptical, blah blah blah. So that's
Yeah.
slightly different than your the Gospel of John up there. But
Yeah.
I certainly like I'm not a theist, and as I've said, and maybe I'm. It depends on what you're talking about. So if it's theism, I'm agnostic. If it's like any version of man-made religion, then I'm atheist. I just don't take serious. I mean, I can't take seriously actual claims that we find in man-made religions. But the claim of theism, I do take very seriously, just generally theism. But okay, so we could debate that. I'm open to talking about this. I don't mean that as just a snipe. I actually am interested in these issues and think there's interesting things to say about all this stuff. Okay, so if the stars arrange themselves in that way, then, and I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't know. Like, I've never seen nothing like that before. It could be aliens. It could be Satan. It could be God. It could be anything. So I would certainly be like, what the hell is going on? Or what is that? But it wouldn't convince me that like God existed right off the bat. I wouldn't immediately jump to that conclusion because it would be so improbable, in my opinion, that that was what was really going on. I would want to know something else, especially given this epistemic problem, and especially given that in religious texts it says things like, Satan is in control of the system of things. He's the one producing all of this stuff. He's going to trick you into thinking the good is bad and bad is good, and all this stuff that's in, because I was raised in a Christian household. I have read the Bible. I do understand I mean, you could take many views on what's in there, but I have read it many times. I do understand what's in there to some extent. So it does say, like, right to your face, like, if you saw something like that, you should be skeptical. So I would just say all that combined together would suggest that I would be skeptical, but I would be like, well, that's suggestive of something supernatural possibly, and I would want to rule that out first before I took any. So yeah, I just think the empirical method is too well entrenched for me to jump to any conclusions to the contrary without investigating it. And no personal experience or anecdote would ever convince me otherwise, except motivate me to investigate with further scrutiny what was going on there. And then if I ever did, under those conditions, came to believe that no natural explanation could account for the thing I was observing, then I would be like, wow, welcome to the supernatural. Here we are. But I wouldn't jump immediately to God, because then I would wonder, which God? Is it Zeus? Is it Yahweh? Is it Allah? Is it Buddha? Is it Krishna? Is it deism? Is it theism? Is it Gnosticism? I mean, I just think so it's just saying like what empirical thing would convince you is too coarse a grain to be looking at this stuff, I would say. But partially it's because I'm a very skeptically minded person, just generally speaking, but not so skeptical that there would be nothing that could convince me. It just would take more than like one star.
Yeah. That's
because
fair.
I saw the three body problem. It wasn't God.
Yeah. So I think I largely agree. So, in the paper, the psychophysical harmony paper that I wrote with Justin Crummett, I mean, what we say is like, look, for simplicity, we are going to just pretend that the options on the table are theism and naturalism.
Right.
Having just those two options on the table, the claim is psychophysical harmony is evidence for theism over naturalism, because it's more likely conditional on theism than conditional on naturalism. Okay. Now, after that, the correct thing to say is yes, but of course those are not the only two options.
Right.
Because theism understood as like something like the omni-god. There's other possibilities that aren't naturalistic. There could be like limited designers. There could be something like Thomas Nagel's teleological laws, whereby the universe like intrinsically strives for the realization of valuable things like consciousness and rationality. There could be impersonal axiarchic views where there's like a basic principle ordering the universe towards the good, but that's like not a personal being. It's just like a law or something.
Right.
And maybe simulation or whatever else. So I 100% agree. I mean, our official view is that psychophysical harmony is evidence against naturalism and for the disjunction of a range of views that include theism and Nagel's weird thing and axiarchism and limited designers of certain kinds, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And that I can agree with.
And the debate between those non-naturalistic views would have to be settled on other terms.
Right.
Now, I happen to think that you can make a case that theism has a higher degree of intrinsic probability than those for kind of like reasons of simplicity and non-arbitrariness. And I mean, I'm largely influenced by the work of Richard Swinburne and others, but that's a whole separate debate,
right.
And that's independent of And by the way, the same goes for these like fine tuning arguments. I mean, it's a familiar point. Like, okay, maybe fine tuning is evidence for something designer-ish,
Right.
but that leaves open a range of possibilities, and certainly more work needs to be done to get like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm totally grant that point.
Yeah. And generally speaking, since this is a point that I like to push a lot, I sort of think that all of these arguments for theism, with the exception of the ontological argument, the one exception, every other argument for theism is actually a better argument for the simulation hypothesis. So that's something that I actually have argued for in other places. But I do think that in the way that you were just suggesting, fine tuning is better explained by the simulation hypothesis than theism. So I don't see why people get to jump immediately to theism as the best explanation. No, no, simulation hypothesis is the best explanation for fine tuning and for all of these things. And I would even say for psychophysical harmony, actually, it's a better explanation. So I do wonder. I know you talk about simulation theodicies, but that's a different idea. In my opinion, that's a different topic. What I'm interested in is the question of, do you think that like the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the psychophysical one, that's a new one that you come up, but I think that one as well, that these arguments, not only are they compatible with the simulation, but they're just like Bayesian wise, they support it better. That should be the one that you take as the conclusion of those arguments.
I think it depends on the argument. So for a lot of the like traditional design arguments like fine tuning, or I guess I would think of psychophysical harmony in this camp. Well, for fine tuning, I think this is probably right. It's probably just as well predicted by the simulation hypothesis as it is by theism, and so the question there would have to be settled on other grounds. Not sure if that's right for standard versions of the cosmological argument. So these often have the conclusion that there is like a necessary causally efficacious being. And, if we're thinking of the simulators as just kind of like, ordinary dudes up in a higher level universe, you might think they're not like simulators so conceived are not like plausible candidates for being necessary beings. I, I,
But what is a necessary being?
well, a being that couldn't fail to that necessarily exists, that couldn't fail to exist.
Uh-huh. So you
So
might
anyway,
define
there would
some
at least be
sense
a
of
question
those
there.
terms in which they are necessary, given our relation to them in this world. So I don't think that. But so that may be a subtle issue, because you're right. They're not necessary in their world, maybe, but they may be necessary in our world, in some sense.
Yeah,
Um,
there's
but
another argument I've written about with Brad Saad that we call the problem of nomological harmony. And here we make the point that it wouldn't be well explained by the simulation hypothesis, because that just pushes the problem back. So basically one version of this is like, okay, you've got a bunch of things with causal powers, but those causal powers are like harmoniously coordinated to allow for like interesting interactions among things. So like, maybe like you could have had like X's and Y's at the initial conditions, but like X's only have the power to move Z's, and Y's only have the power to move Q's. And so there's just like these things don't have reciprocally coordinated powers, so that
right.
nothing happens with them. And so like the fact that like the basic causal powers of things are harmoniously coordinated, so as to allow for like interesting temporal evolution of the universe, is something that's like we think is not a necessary truth, maybe calls for explanation. And here I think that the simulation hypothesis wouldn't work, because it would just kind of push the problem back. Because take the higher level universe that has the computer that runs the simulation that is our universe. In order to have like a physical computer, you got to have like multiple interacting parts whose powers are harmoniously coordinated with one another. So that would just kind of move the bump
But
in the
why does
road.
it have to be a physical computer? I mean, by our standards, by our terms, it wouldn't be physical, since it's not part of our physical world.
Well, I get
So whatever it is would be
it would have to
non-physical
have
from our
multiple
point of view.
interacting parts,
Well,
whether
why
we
do you
call
think
them.
that? I mean, is God a simple thing that has multiple interacting parts?
No,
No, so why couldn't the base level reality be like that as well? If the non-sim, so what you're assuming is that the non-simulated world will be like the simulated world, but a kind of Kantian humility should suggest that that's, if you take the simulation hypothesis, that's not guaranteed. The non-simulated world, whichever world it is outside the simulation, if there is one, because some people think the whole thing is a kind of self-simulation. If that makes sense, I don't know, but some people think it does. So who knows? There could be strange loops and weird things, closed time-like curves and all sorts of strange stuff. Who knows?
well, at any rate, it would.
But the point though is that whatever the non-simulated world is like, you don't really have any reason to expect it to be like ours. So there's no worry that it gets pushed back, unless you think that there's. I mean, that's like me saying, "Who designed the designer?" to you. It's like, well, no, I'm assuming there's a non-designed thing that resists this idea that everything is designed, that somehow is the cause of it or something. So we don't know. And that non-simulated world wouldn't be God if it wasn't a mind that acted in certain ways. It would just be reality. So I don't think you have any reason to rule these things out a priori based on like what we know about this given simulation.
Well, conceivably there could be. So conceivably there could be computers maybe that didn't have like multiple interacting parts with coordinated causal powers. But anyway, the versions of the simulation hypothesis that wouldn't just push the problem back would be like a narrow subset of the different possible versions of the
Right.
simulation hypothesis. So I'm going to say that's going to have a correspondingly lower prior. So even if you can find some like very specific version of the simulation hypothesis that doesn't just push the problem back, and maybe it equally predicts the datum, but it's going to have a correspondingly lower prior. And so anyway, that's the kind of move I would make.
But it's going to be exact parity with respect to the prior for God from the other point of view, because you're just pushing back towards something more implausible, something simple that's unexplainable, that did everything. So in each case, you're just kind of going, that sounds implausible. And each side's going, yeah, that sounds implausible. And I don't really see like, so these pushback arguments, which I can see why people would think that, because, maybe there's simulations in simulations, and okay, so maybe it's all like this out there, but it's also maybe not all like this. And I think that the space of that which is logically possible is well beyond the stuff like this, giving rise to computation. Read some science fiction, you'll see all sorts of interesting ideas, and that's just scratching the surface. Speaking of the three-body problem, that guy had some very interesting ideas about hidden dimensions, and anyway, I don't want to bring all that stuff up. I'm just saying that like the stuff that you could consider it hasn't even begun to be scratched. So it just seems to me that a lot of these assumptions are you're corralling the assumptions to push towards that which you want already, which is theism, or that something is better explained in a certain way. Whereas, like for me, I just see like it going the other way. So I don't really see. Yeah, I'm not sure how you're supposed to proceed forward. I guess what I'm saying is like these kinds of arguments. I wonder how convincing they're supposed to be to someone, because I don't know. You might think there's two different jobs. One job, which I'm on board 100% with, is kind of mapping the conceptual space and saying, if you start here, you can move like this through the space, and you can end up over there. And it might be surprising, and you might go, I didn't know you could get over there. I thought they were incompatible. And that's kind of how I view a lot of your work. And from my point of view, it's very interesting from that point of view. But on the other hand, you might think like mapping where I should be in the space. Like how should I reason my way to the conclusion that I find probable? And there I can't really see the force of the kind of arguments that we're talking about, which would push me to believe something that I didn't already believe, which therefore makes me suspicious of that kind of reasoning. Because if it's only going to lead me to that which I already find plausible or accept, then it's sort of, I don't really trust it, to be honest. I want a system that leads me to that which I find surprising and is not contained already in the things that I believe. That's the value of science, in my opinion. That's why science is so valuable and important and surprising and interesting. And I just don't see that here. I see rather that you could get to anywhere. You could literally get to anywhere if you set things in the right way. and then that makes me uneasy when I'm asking what should I believe instead of how should we map the space.
So yeah, so I mean, so
And maybe
we're,
this is beyond what you care about. Trust me, I've gone beyond already. So if you want to say I don't care, that that would be
no,
an acceptable response.
I do. I mean, I do agree. There's this distinction in what we might try to do in philosophy, and one is more kind of mapping the space of possibilities, and the other is like trying to argue for like pretty specific substantive conclusions that like this is where we should be
I'm
in
gonna
the
shut my
space.
window. Just one second.
Okay. Um, yeah. So, and the second is like, no, we should like, and this is the most plausible part of the space of possibilities to be in.
Right.
I guess I think both are totally legitimate things to do, and there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So
Yeah.
one advantage to just mapping the space of possibilities is you're less likely to go deeply wrong because you're not really sticking your neck out or making positive claims. You're just saying it could be this way, it could be this way. Here's some distinctions, and here's the useful way of looking at things, and that can be immensely clarifying and intellectually satisfying, and kind of like give us new gestalts on questions. And I think that's a really cool thing to do.
Right.
But I also think there's a place in philosophy for the like sticking your neck out and saying like, yeah, but here's the thing I think is probably true, and here are my reasons for thinking that it's probably true. And of course, this is philosophy, so I expect at the end of the day that there's going to be dramatic disagreement. I don't expect that my arguments for dualism or for theism or for free will or anything are going to like convince all the people who are on the other side. But I think that's not really the ambition. The ambition is like, can you give kind of interestingly new, reasonably forceful arguments for certain views that maybe people hadn't factored in. So when it comes to whether it's free will or consciousness or God or personal identity or whatever, of course people have their like default, their kind of like natural inclinations and default views. But my background assumption is most people haven't thought through all the ins and outs of all the potential motivations, and sometimes you just like do find an argument where it's like, whoa, actually I'd never thought of it from that angle before, and when I think of it from that angle, actually I see a plausible case here. I mean, I can report that I know of multiple people who have like come to accept theism on the basis of the psychophysical harmony argument. So which is more than I expected. I mean, usually I give arguments and
no one cares.
convince anybody. Like, how often
You're
do
like,
you
colors
convince
are
people?
real, man. They're like,
Yeah. Or maybe it just kind of moves the needle a bit where someone's like, okay, I see there's a little bit more cost than I thought to this, or a little bit more going for this. But, in this case, I just like, I do know several people who like have found these considerations moving and have, had the reaction of like, oh yeah, I was already sympathetic to dualism, and I'd never really pieced through that there is something strikingly fortunate about the way in which consciousness is paired with physical reality, and actually that does call for explanation. And I'd never quite thought of things from that angle, but once you've got me thinking along this path, I actually see like, there's something kind of fishy about naturalism.
Yeah.
So it's obviously not doing the trick for you, and I wouldn't expect it to do the trick for a lot of people, but it's that's not the goal in philosophy.
I agree.
My ambitions are not to convince everyone to like my detailed views on every particular issue, but if I can like get people to like open up to possibilities that they weren't open up towards, or nudge a few people in that direction, then I think that's cool.
I agree. I was only pessimistically suggesting that maybe those people who did change their minds did so for motivated reasons that weren't fully rational. But that's a topic, that's sort of what we've been talking about, is what style of argument as forming a personal belief is legitimate.
Do you think that's true for every controversial view that people hold views about there is free will, there isn't free will, it's compatible with determinism, it's not, consciousness is physical, consciousness is non-physical, morality is objective, it's not, etc. Like for
I think if you're not an agnostic,
views,
then
people
the
have
answer is
arguments for
yes.
these views. Do you think they're all just kind of like irrational motivated reasoning, or does anyone have any like honest, reasonable arguments for anything in philosophy, or is it just like
If you're
theism
asking,
where the suspicion? Yeah, I just
if you're asking me personally, my view is if
yeah.
you're not agnostic, then yes, the answer is yes, you're engaging in motivated reasoning. Yes, absolutely.
About
Everything.
everything in philosophy.
In philosophy, that's not empirically grounded. Yeah,
That's a bold claim.
I know. I know.
So
I'm here
wait,
to
so
be
are you
bold, my
agnostic
friend.
about so if I had to like go through a list of like classic questions in philosophy that you might cover in an intro philosophy class, like, you know, personal identity over time, free will, uh, God, et cetera, et cetera. Across the board, you're just going to say, I'm agnostic, I'm agnostic, I'm agnostic. I don't have leanings one way or the other.
Oh, I
Is
have
that your?
leanings out the yin yang. I don't think they're rationally justifiable from an objective point of view, so I don't endorse them. But I lean all sorts of ways. I want that. I lean this way. It seems to me reasonable over there. Yeah, I get pushed and pulled. I just can't say I believe any of that stuff. That's why I started off saying I'm not a physicalist. I simply think that physicalism hasn't been refuted by a priori methods. So I'm agnostic. I think physicalism is a possibility. It hasn't been refuted, but yet I feel like in your work, and a lot of people actually, they feel like it's sort of obvious that it's been refuted. In fact, some people on the internet screamed in my face like, it's contradictory, it's incoherent, it's logically absurd. Why won't you realize it? And I'm just like, no, it's not actually. It's a serious view. It's just you don't like it. So it
I
does.
agree. I agree. It's a serious view. I definitely wouldn't use language as strong as saying it's been refuted.
Oh,
I
but there
mean,
are people out there that do, like Philip
yeah.
Goff, like for example, goes around everywhere saying this is incoherent. It's an incoherent view. Like, gee, thanks, bro. I didn't know I was such a silly guy. But oh well. So I do find this kind of terminology out there. It is why, and you do write that way in many of your papers, suggesting to one that if you don't um, endorse dualism, you aren't taking the hard problem seriously, sort of like you did at the beginning of this discussion. I think of myself as taking the hard problem very seriously, but still thinking that physicalism survives. And I'm not an eliminativist. I don't like illusionism. I think that's cheating. I think consciousness could be physical, probably is actually. If I had to say, if I said what I believe, I would say it's physical. But I think no, there's too many disagreements, evidence, argument, and then I reason myself to say, well, gee, I kind of lean that way, but I can't endorse it. I just simply think you're wrong if you think it's not, if it should be dismissed. And I say the same thing about dualism, panpsychism. You know, out of all the isms, I kind of like quantum dualism. That's my favorite. I'm least friendly towards panpsychism, but I'm equally open to those views in the sense that I don't think you can dismiss them. We don't know. So I just think that's
Berkeley and idealism, is that on the list too?
yeah. In fact, there's, the new book, The View from Everywhere by Helen Yeller Chappelle,
Helen
which
Uter
is
Chappelle.
defending this kind of
Yeah.
Berkeley and idealism. So I think it's out there. There's also the objective form of idealism that you find in people like Bernardo Kastrup, which I think is a serious view and should be taken seriously. So I just don't think that. So I think if you want to take those views, if you want to really endorse those views, you have to dismiss physicalism first. And I just don't think anyone's successfully done that. That's why we're having this argument. I just don't think it's been dismissed. I don't think that you should endorse it. I think you should remain agnostic about it. And the same is true for free will. I want to believe in libertarian free will. It's hard to see how it could exist. I think it probably does. So I'm agnostic about whether it is or isn't there. But yes, I think that there's nothing wrong about being agnostic. And I do, just on a kind of summing up note, find that a lot of difference between theists generally and people like me who don't consider themselves theists is this living in the uncertainty, being comfortable or not. And I feel like sometimes you get the impression that theists want this kind of comforting certainty that things are this way. And that it's uncomfortable to like not know and to be forced to say, yeah, we don't really know. Like, I'm worried about Kripkenstein worries for meaning. I'm worried. I take all of these things very seriously because I engage in, argument, and the arguments are serious in my opinion. So I do seriously endorse this kind of agnosticism. Actually, it's not paralytic or cowardice. It doesn't mean you can't engage in reasoning or that you're too afraid to endorse something. It just seems to me to be kind of the open recognition that a lot of this is kind of just my intuitive pre-theoretical judgments being influenced by the theories I come to accept later, which then become pre-theoretically seeming to me. And you can't really break out of that circle too easily. So yeah, I don't think that's a bad thing. So for me, non-theistically, I'm happy to say I don't know. It's very strange what's going on. Let's do the science. Let's do the philosophy. Let's map it out. And I'm suspicious of the principle of sufficient reason. I don't think we have good reason to accept it. But I feel like your side of things is really relying on that, relying on the idea that somehow reality is intelligible to us, that we deserve to know it, that it is like it owes us to be understandable. And I find all of that not certain and not stable, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't expect that reality is like wholly intelligible to the human mind, but that's.
But that's
I,
what.
I wonder how far your agnosticism goes. So we've been talking about like agnosticism with respect to these like classic philosophical problems, but a stronger version would extend this into the domain of empirical science, where you might say, well, we can't know whether the theory of evolution is true, or whether heliocentrism is the right model of the solar system, or whether the Earth is round, or whether so I would guess that you're not going to be agnostic to that extent.
Well, I'm
Is
gonna
that
say
like
that
are you agnostic as to whether the Earth is more than 6,000 years old, for example?
in some sense, I am. Yes, that
I mean, just in okay.
that you can't rule it out as being a legitimate possibility. The Earth could have been created just at the before we started talking. In fact, all of reality might have come into existence as I started
Sure.
saying this word now. That's all logically possible.
It's all
But
logically
that
possible.
doesn't.
Maybe we can't rule it out with certainty,
Yeah,
but I would
exactly.
say like
But I haven't finished
we
yet.
are at least justified in being very, very, very confident that the Earth is more than 6,000 years old
Yeah,
on the basis of
and
the
I would
evidence.
say we know it.
Granted that like absolute certainty is not to be had.
Right, and
Um,
I would say we know that.
okay.
But I would say you shouldn't have to be agnostic about it because we've arrived at it at a method that deserves doesn't deliver certainty but delivers this high degree of like yeah probably.
But ordinary philosophy does not employ such a method.
Ordinary philosophy allows you to motivatedly reason your way to any conclusion that you want, as we were sort of suggesting before. What doesn't allow you to do that is the empirical method. And even though
Yep.
people try to use the empirical method to do that, it backfires in the long run and it doesn't succeed. And science is the only thing we've ever discovered where if you stupidly do it over and over again, you end up correcting your mistakes. And philosophy isn't that way. When you do it over and over again, you build the mistakes in. So you have to be careful. And I just don't think that science is imperfect, but I think it's the best way of knowing about the world for these reasons.
If philosophy doesn't have a method that gives us knowledge or even justified confidence in the answers to really any of its questions, why is philosophy worth doing?
Because there's value in agnosticism and the Socratic dictum that I know that I don't know is probably the single most valuable philosophical insight that any single person could ever have. The recognition that you truly don't know, that the thing that seemed obvious isn't. So to me, that seems to be extremely valuable, that recognition. And it's rare to find people who face it openly. And when you bring people to that edge and show them that they truly don't know, they react violently sometimes. And it's uncomforting and unsettling. Thus is the abyss, which stares back on all the, existentialism stuff. But I think this is exactly the why it's valuable. In the personal instance, I would say that's why philosophy is valuable, to bring you, and that's what Socrates said. This is why we're doing it, bro. We're doing it so you could get to the point where you recognize it's more complicated. And I feel like we've lost sight of that sort of as a discipline, as a personal exercise. I think it's very important. However, in the professional aspect, I think the job of philosophy is this mapping thing we were talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that's my professional job, is to engage in the mapping. But my job as a human being, my job as a person, is to engage in this deep reflection and arrive at agnosticism, to recognize that we don't know and that's okay, and that we're striving to know, and that everything is more complicated than it seems. So that seems to me to be okay to be in that position. And that's why I think, theism is a possibility. Like it certainly is. It would be nice if it were true and all that stuff, although it's such a narrow target to aim for. but anyway, that's a different topic. So I do think that, yeah, maybe this uncomfortability with, and in the online space, you get this a lot where you have these debates between atheists and religious persons. And one side is saying, well, you can't explain these things, and therefore, you're wrong. And the other side saying, wait, yeah, it's okay to not know. And so I sort of feel like, yeah, it's okay to not know. We should champion that more often. And I'm not the kind of agnostic like Russell, just so you know. Russell was like, I'm agnostic about Zeus and all these kind of insulting things, in my opinion. I don't think I need to be agnostic about Zeus. Mount Olympus doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That's a different story. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic. I mean, I definitely agree. Like in many domains, people need to learn the lesson of you don't know the things you think you know, and you're way overconfident. And this domain is much more complicated than you think it is.
Yeah.
And in many domains, agnosticism just absolutely is called for. I mean, I think this is true in a lot of like political discussions that are just like vastly more complicated than
Well, that's a hot button for sure.
Partisans are inclined to think. And I mean, it's definitely true with a huge amount of metaphysics, and I think it's true with a lot of like religious and associated metaphysical issues there. That I mean, there are definitely people who just like claim to just like know or be reasonably confident of like, not just the existence of God, but like how many hierarchies of angels there, like all this like specific stuff where it's like, okay, like this is like clearly this is like a mysterious domain where you should be like a lot more open to like there being tons of stuff beyond our ken. So I agree with that. I guess I'm also of the attitude that like as in other areas, virtue is a mean between extremes here, and it is possible to be to be excessively like unopinionated. I mean, I think agnosticism about Zeus, for example, would be an example, or agnosticism about like a strong agnosticism about whether the Earth is over 6,000 years old, where you claim not just that we can't rule it out with certainty, but just like we have no idea.
Right, exactly.
That I think would not be hitting the virtuous mean. On certain issues, maybe you and I would disagree about like when and where, what kind of agnosticism would be reasonable. But yeah, I think it's an important point that
and by the way,
people are inclined to overestimate how much they know or can know about lots and lots of domains.
And just to say, in a conciliatory tone, this is what I've always admired about philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, who I don't know if he's emeritus at Notre Dame right now, if he's still hanging around. But anyway, his work's obviously extremely influential. But like when he discusses the ontological argument, and the way I read it, and I'm not a Plantinga scholar, so trust me, I could be definitely misreading it. Anyone who's ever looked at my blog knows I've struggled through the years trying to understand what he's saying in the system of modal logic and all that stuff. Anyway, but the way that I read it is the virtuous, or what is it, the victorious modal argument, ontological argument, is merely aimed at justifying his belief. Since he finds it conceivable that there's a perfect being, then Plantinga, is justified in accepting this. But since I virtually find it inconceivable, I can't even really picture it, to be honest with you, without contradictions. And if you allow contradictions in, then I can picture it fine. But that's the difference. You might wonder paraconsistency, what doesn't follow from that. But anyway, so my point though is that if you take that way of thinking about it, then he's simply saying, yeah, I can reason my way to this. I can justify my motivated reasoning by saying blah, 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 blah. And I think to myself, yeah, I get over there because I'm over. And so it's just kind of agreeing with my point in a way that he's saying, I'm not irrational for doing this. I can give you a justification, but it's a cherry picked one. It's definitely gerrymandered, like beyond recognition on both sides.
I mean, I agree with respect to the ontological argument, and really any version of the ontological argument I'm really not a fan of.
Oh, you're not? Oh, that's the one I'm the most a fan of.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think if there's anyone that like you would want to work, it would be that one. But
well, I mean, I wanted to work. I mean, one thing that's nice about it is it delivers a conclusion where there's not really much gap between
Right.
the being that you get and something that deserves to be called God.
That's the why
Whereas
it's the most interesting one.
the others,
Yeah.
there's a bit of a gap. Maybe you've got like a necessary being, or you've got an intelligent designer, but doesn't have the other attributes.
Exactly.
But the downside of the argument is it just doesn't work. The ontological argument. Anyway,
But so what I'm kind of saying is that I see that way that victorious ontological argument goes is kind of the way with almost everything, and it's kind of just like the Quinean point that it's like everything's kind of theory based for us, and we're all kind of just working within theories, and what seems intuitive to you depends on your implicit theory you have in the background, and you might not notice it, but I certainly had the experience of sitting in classes and being told what was and wasn't on Twin Earth and being like, what? That's not, no, like, there's no, yeah, that you're wrong. And they were like telling me I just don't understand philosophy. And I'm going, wait a minute, no, I just don't agree with the way you're interpreting this situation. But certainly in my career as an undergraduate, and I'd be like, if we found, like, for example, I remember in class saying they were telling us about Putnam's cats. And if we found out that they were Martian spies or whatever, then cats or animals is empirically justifiable or whatever, and we'd find out it's not analytic. And I was like, no, nah, we'd find out that these aren't cats. Like, what are you talking about? Cats or animals is clearly analytic. And they were just telling me I didn't understand a thought experiment, and I was like, no. And now I feel in the fullness of time sort of that this is my diagnosis of those kinds of situations. It just seems to me it's rampant everywhere that people are too quick to say you don't understand or you're wrong, when really it's just that you have a different intuition about some base case because of this implicit thing you're assuming in the background, which is coloring the way you think of what's possible and what isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you don't think that. You think you can kind of get out of that?
Well, I guess my view would be, of course, like your background assumptions and priors and so forth are going to shape like your conclusions about any range of issues. But I guess I'm also of the opinion that some background assumptions and priors are just less reasonable than others. So someone who can like reason through all the data and come out with flat Earth conclusions where they explain away all the seemingly contrary data in terms of like global conspiracies and stuff like this.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a kind of logically consistent set of assumptions that you can bring to the table that will get you flat Earth conclusions and explain away all the contrary evidence. But I guess I'd want to say there's something objectively less reasonable about those background assumptions or priors than the ones that would lead you to the conclusion that the Earth is round.
Right.
And similarly with all the things that people want to say to justify like young Earth creationism, or pick your favorite crazy conspiracy theory, QAnon or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe like someone who's like sufficiently internally consistent and has thought through all the implications of their views, I'm not going to be able to talk them out of their flat Earth view or their QAnon conspiracy or their view that like high up politicians are lizard people in human suits or whatever. But I still think even though I can't talk them out of it, they're still being unreasonable in a way that I'm not being unreasonable when I think that they aren't lizard people or the Earth is round.
I mean, the interesting problem is that there is a clear demarcation here, but then the problem is who goes on what side of it, because that's where we're gonna find a lot of disagreement. Is like you're gonna say that's unreasonable, like that physicalism maybe is going on the unreasonable side, like more like flat earther, and I'm gonna say no. Theism goes on that side. So I think you're gonna get a lot of the same kind of
like it would be crazy to like treat David Lewis as on a par with a flat earther. I mean, David Lewis is
exactly.
my intellectual superior in just about every respect, even though
Exactly.
of course I think he's wrong on this particular issue.
Yeah.
In a way, this is kind of like the problem of pure disagreement, or in this case, the problem of superior disagreement.
Exactly.
Like pretty much everyone, they can find people who are smarter than them, better informed than them,
and believe in counterpart theory.
who reason to conclusions that like I think are dumb. And I guess one view is like, but I shouldn't just be agnostic about everything. Like just because I can find like one guy who was smarter than me and knew the arguments as well as I did who came to this conclusion. But I mean, there's also, on the other hand, and maybe this is more to your sensibility, there is something kind of uncomfortable about the thought that like I'm going to believe that P, even though this other guy who's just as smart as me, just as intellectually honest, knows the arguments and evidence just as well as I do,
Exactly.
comes to the conclusion that not P. I mean, this is kind of like the tension within the pure disagreement literature,
Exactly.
uh,
Yeah, I
the
think
higher
it's a
order
similar
ones.
tension. Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. So we're not going to solve these issues, son. Wow, dang, we're fired. But I think this discussion is important to have and see how it relates to these issues here because I do feel like sometimes the discussion gets oversimplified to these like, okay, there's these two options. We're assuming these are the background conditions, and it just seems
Mhm.
way more complicated. So I think we brought that out. And I know I got to let you go, but I do want to just say at the end, sort of ambushing you with this last point here, which is that given all the things we've saying, I mean, so it seems like you would agree with me that consciousness being physical is conceivable.
I don't think it's conceivable in the sense of being like ideally coherently conceivable, ideally positively conceivable.
Okay, you don't. So you
Um,
don't think that Benny Wagner could be right? I mean, obviously you don't. You disagree with them, but I mean, you don't think it's possible, besides epistemically possible.
there might be like a higher order epistemic possibility that I'm wrong, but I guess yeah, I mean, I at least can't conceive of consciousness being identical, turning out to be identical with some physical brain structure. Um, at some like meta level, yeah, I guess I'll concede that like it's possible that I'm wrong and it is conceivable in principle, even though I can't manage to do it, and it seems, but yeah, I mean, so like I guess I'm inclined to say it's not conceivable, but nonetheless, I think physicalism is in some sense an epistemic possibility. Like I
Uh-huh.
think it would be unreasonable for me to rule it out with absolute certainty, partly for these higher order reasons. Like,
Yeah. So that's
can
how
I
I
be
feel
absolutely
about
certain that like
dualism.
David Lewis was deeply confused?
Yeah, that would be weird.
I think he was in this domain, but like it would seem like overconfident to be absolutely certain of that. So I guess in some sense I allow it as an epistemic possibility, though it's one that, I'm happy to just say I think it's probably wrong, and now like let's try to figure out what are the interesting consequences of the view that I think is most likely right.
Right. So because the way I think of things is I have a kind of conceivability argument against non-dualism. I think that non-dualists are committed to a kind of necessary a modal claim, such that necessarily for any possible world where there's just physics like ours and that's it, there can't be consciousness there. That's a necessary claim that
Yeah.
kind of defines dualism, a modal claim.
Yeah.
So to show that that's wrong, you would need to find one possible world where there was only physical things that and consciousness that was
Mhm.
physical. And I think you can conceive of that just fine. I mean, I think that's what the identity theory is, and I conceive of that all the time since it's my favorite view, and I write about it and think about it, and I met, and John Perry and all these people we seem to be thinking about things along these lines. We're not totally confused. One might think, I don't know. So I think it's conceivable that consciousness is physical, and I also like 2D semantics to some extent. And I
Mhm.
sort of think that it can't be the case that both zombies and these other creatures that I have called shombies are both ideally conceivable. Because given these things we were saying before, ideally one of these is going to be ruled out if you add in the facts. Whether it counts as a priori or not, it's just going to be ruled out. You either will or will not be able to a priori deduce from the physical facts that there is consciousness or that this consciousness exists.
Yeah.
So, okay, great. Um, but I think that's conceivable. You think it's not conceivable. But if it is conceivable, then dualism is wrong. And if it isn't conceivable, then physicalism is wrong.
Well,
So the only thing we have here is like prima facie conceivable, is how I would
well,
put it. Not
I mean,
ideally conceivability.
one possibility is it is conceivable that like pain is a physical property, but it's not possible because maybe
Oh, but
conceivability
I
just
like 2D
it,
semantics. So no,
yeah,
we're
yeah.
ruling
So
that out. Yeah,
so
yeah.
but I guess if the parity argument really is just as powerful and the corresponding conceivability claims are just as powerful, then I think the thing to say is, well, maybe conceivability wasn't such a good guide to possibility after all, and then you would just try to settle the question of physicalism on other grounds. I mean, for what it's worth, I
Really,
think,
that's how you would go. I see. That's interesting.
well, yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I don't put all my eggs in the conceivability argument basket. I think there are good motivations for rejecting identity physicalism that don't rely directly on conceivability considerations. So, like, I mean, it would be
The
too
mini
elaborate
subject
to spell
stuff
it
and
out,
all that kind of
but
stuff.
like Adam Pautz's arguments, I think are pretty good here. I mean, he's got a bunch of different arguments against identity physicalism that
I know. I want to get him to come on here and
yeah, you should. I think his stuff is about as good as anyone's in any
yeah, I've
moving
invited
forms
him
for
several
mine
times. It
today.
hasn't worked out, but it almost did once, and then something sad happened. But anyway, so it's I don't think his arguments work. Obviously, I think
Yeah, so of course you're going to disagree there, but the other thing I'd say is, yeah, I mean, so I do think that the psychophysical identity claims are going to not be conceivable. And I mean, an analogy I would give is like I don't think it's conceivable that the property of being red is identical to the property of being round. Um, and similarly, I think it's not conceivable that the property of feeling pain is identical to the property of having C fibers firing or whatever. Um,
yeah, but
Actually, I'm
that's
curious. Do
question
you
that's
agree with that
question
claim about?
begging. That
Do
that's
you,
that's question begging. That's like me
well,
saying it's impossible for maroon to exist without redness. Yeah, that fact is true, but saying
no,
that
yeah,
the mind is like that is like completely question begging.
I wasn't even really giving an argument. I was just kind of using an analogy to
Oh,
state what my position is. But well, I mean,
sorry.
do you agree that at least in the case of redness and roundness, that it's not conceivable that they be identical? I'm just
Uh,
wondering, like
yeah,
how extensive
I
your
sort of see
confusion.
it seems that way. Yeah, that they could come
Okay,
apart and
so
you have redness without roundness and roundness without redness.
yeah, I mean, it'd be a further claim to say that like we should treat that case on a par with the psychophysical identity claims. But yeah, I would be inclined to treat
Right.
those cases as kind of analogous.
Exactly. And I would treat them like the maroonness and redness, that you're asking to separate redness from maroonness, which doesn't make sense. Like wherever there's one, there's the other. So of course they don't come apart. So the debate is going to be the same. Like which is the right way to think about, like the things we're both saying are true. Like every time there's maroon, there's also red. Great. But you can't separate them. So is the mind and brain like that? That whenever you have one, you have the other because it just is that way, and that's a priori fact about reality, which if you knew enough, you would know. So my view is that the only reason Mary doesn't know this stuff is because she doesn't have the right concepts. She doesn't have the phenomenal concept of red. She's never seen red. So the only thing that's weird about the Mary's room is that she can't acquire the concepts which are required for her to a priori know the stuff we're talking about. And no one would ever say, hey, could you know that water is H2O but not have the concept of water? I mean, that would be what? What are you talking about? Of course not. You need to have the concept. And then once you have the concept of water, you can ask the question, is water H2O? So Mary doesn't have the right concept. She doesn't have the phenomenal concept.
But
So
I think even if you modify the thought experiment to give her the concepts,
then she
she
would
still
know.
can't know. So imagine a version of the Mary case where before we let her out, we show her a red patch and a green patch, but we don't tell her, we don't label them red or green.
She would know
So,
instantly which was which. What are you talking about?
so well, just to fill out the thought experiment. So I'm imagining that she looks at the red patch. We don't label it, but she just calls it like, well, that's a type A experience.
No, she would call it
To
red.
the green patch and says that's a type B
She
experience.
would call it
And then
green.
you say like which one would you have when when you look at a tomato or when your brain goes into this physical configuration? You think she could know that she'll have a type A experience?
Of course.
Oh, whoa. Yeah.
She would know that her brain would go into such and such a state, and that red is similar to pink and less similar to green, and she would have the physical color space mapped out because those are things that can be empirically studied from inside her room, mapping out the responses that people have, the brain states that they go into, the stimuli that are presented, and so forth and so on. So she would, of course, know that if the tomato would be red, it would be obvious if she had the concept. First, you have to give her that concept. They should be like, yeah, it's tomatoes, grass, done.
Do you think we can work out a priori whether a robot that's functionally identical to me would have a reddish experience when it looks at tomatoes?
Oh, it depends on. Well, I think so.
That seems like an open question. Like it might have a reddish experience, it might have no experience, it might have like an alien experience, it might have a greenish experience.
If we knew
But it
all the
sounds like your attitude is
physical,
like, no, if you knew all the physical details of the robot and its, functional properties and how it interacts with light and so on, like you would be able to figure out whether it has an experience like ours.
um, I think you would. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
But we
another
can't
point of
now, and
difference.
it seems impossible now because we don't know how to do it. But so I do like the biological kind of views, and I do think that maybe robots won't have experiences unless there's some very like generic biological property like electrical current or something, which is the thing that's relevant. But we don't really know.
Okay.
So I think that that's a possibility, but yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical of machine consciousness for reasons that I'm, to the degree that I like identity theories, but I'm open to machine consciousness to the degree I recognize that identity theories are not, known to be true. So I don't
Well,
know. I kind of agnostic about machine consciousness, but I like precautionary principles. So I think we should act as though until we know, but we may not know for
yeah,
a while.
it's really interesting. I actually need to go and
Yeah, I've
teach,
already kept you so long.
actually
I
about
know.
these issues. I'm going to teach about Nick Bostrom's arguments that AI will kill us all in short order.
Oh, very good.
So,
Well, Brian, we barely scratched to scratch the surface. Your work
oh,
is
I
so
know.
deep and so interesting, and I know I got to let you go. So I just want to thank you for spending this time with me. I want to maybe someday you'll come back if you could.
Yeah,
Could we have? There's like I want to talk about the color realism and
yeah,
against
that would be great.
panpsychism, and there's so many the arguments for dualism. I think there's an empirically based argument against dualism. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
But I want to say that I've enjoyed this conversation, and I think that people like you are so valuable because you're exploring these things with an open, clear mind that people have dismissed. So, like defending dualism, for example, people are like, "That's ridiculous." No, it's not actually. You got to go through the actual details. It's hard. So I really admire that about your work, that you go through the details and that you kind of sort it out. And
yeah,
so I've been pressing you on this or that detail, but I don't want you to take away from this that I'm a critic of your work. I'm a fan
yeah,
of your
yeah.
work and your style of doing it too. So I just wanted to make that clear.
I appreciate that. It's been a pleasure talking. Thanks so much for having me on.
Cool. So just hang out for a sec. I'll say off air. Bye.
Okay.
Clicking buttons.